Edward Hartwell froze in the doorway, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. His 5-year-old daughter, Clara, the little girl who hadn't taken a single step since the car accident that killed her mother 2 years ago, was walking, not being held up, not clinging to furniture, walking, 4 unsteady, determined steps, straight toward him. This was the same child every doctor, every specialist, every expensive therapist had written off with a grim shake of the head. She may never walk again. Yet here she was, barefoot on the polished floor, giggling, her eyes sparkling with a joy he hadn't seen in years, as if defying every prediction, every limit. It was impossible. And it was happening right in front of him. If you're watching this right now, I want to know. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. And before we dive into what happened next, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Your support helps us share more stories that will shock you, inspire you, and stay in your heart long after they're told. Now, let's go back to the moment that changed everything. The storm outside pounded against the glass walls of the Monterey villa, rain streaming in silver streaks across the wide windows, the wind howling like something alive. Edward had come home earlier than planned from San Francisco, his mind full of meetings, investor calls, and numbers that wouldn't stop turning over in his head. He stepped inside expecting the usual. Silence. Since Lily's death. The house had been little more than a cold shell, expensive and immaculate, but hollow. Yet tonight was different. Tonight. A sound stopped him in his tracks. Laughter. Not the polite, forced laugh he sometimes coaxed out of Clara with gifts she didn't ask for, but a deep, bubbling, unrestrained laugh, the kind she used to have before the accident. The sound drew him into the living room, where the scene waiting for him was almost surreal. Nia Thompson, the new housekeeper he had hired barely 2 weeks earlier, was crouched low on the rug, her jeans faded, her sweater loose and soft. She held Clara's tiny hands, guiding her in a game they called airplane, swaying side to side, letting her pretend to fly. Clara's legs were trembling, but they were moving, actually moving, across the floor, and then, without warning, Nia let go. For a second, Clara wobbled, her arms outstretched for balance, and then she took 4 small steps, all on her own, toward him, standing off to the side. Dr. Helen Carver, the child psychologist he'd been paying for months, crossed her arms, her expression hard. "This isn't physical therapy," she said sharply, as if Nia's playful approach was a personal insult to her profession. But Edward wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on Clara, his mind replaying the countless mornings he had carried her from bed to chair, the days he had tried to coax her into standing, the thousands of dollars he had poured into specialists, hoping for even the smallest sign of progress. Now, in the middle of a storm, without any official therapy session, his daughter had just walked. Clara looked up at him with a smile so wide it almost hurt to see. "Daddy, I walked!" she shouted, her voice filled with pride and wonder. The words cut through him like sunlight through cloud. He wanted to rush to her, to sweep her into his arms. But part of him stood frozen, afraid that touching this fragile moment might somehow make it vanish. Nia glanced up at him, her dark eyes steady, almost daring him to admit what he had just seen. "Dr." Carver broke the silence again, her tone colder this time. "She's not ready for this. Overexertion could cause a setback." "She's ready," Nia said calmly, her voice low but certain. "She just needed someone to believe it." Edward's chest tightened. He remembered that night, 2 years ago, when everything changed. Lily had been driving Clara home from the beach. The rain had come in fast, the roads slick. Edward had been in Palo Alto, trapped in a product launch meeting he thought couldn't wait. By the time the phone call came, Lily was gone. Clara had survived. But within weeks she refused to walk, the doctors calling it psychosomatic paralysis, her body's way of holding on to trauma. Edward had responded the only way he knew how. He threw money at the problem. Specialists, private therapy, state-of-the-art equipment, anything money could buy, and nothing had worked. The storm outside roared, the waves slamming into the cliff below, the sound rumbling through the villa's floors. Edward looked at Clara again, still standing with Nia, still smiling, and something in him began to shift. It unsettled him, not because he was afraid it would fail, but because it was working, and he didn't understand why. "What exactly is this?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. "Play," Nia said simply. "The thing she's been missing since her mom died. The thing you can't buy in a clinic." Dr. Carver scoffed. "This is why untrained help should never interfere in treatment." "And this," Nia replied without looking at her, "is why some children never heal, because no one bothers to see them as more than a diagnosis." Edward felt his jaw clench. Every instinct told him to trust the credentials, the degrees on the wall. And yet, here was Clara, proving them wrong. Clara let go of Nia's hands again and took 2 more steps toward him before stumbling. He caught her without thinking, lifting her into his arms. She smelled like rain and soap, her hair damp against his cheek. "You walked," he whispered, his voice breaking. The rest of the evening blurred, Dr. Carver muttering about liability, Nia carrying Clara upstairs for bedtime, Edward standing alone at the window, watching the storm batter the coast. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of Clara's tiny legs carrying her forward, her smile lighting up the room. He didn't know it yet, but that night would mark the beginning of a battle, not just for Clara's recovery, but for his own place in her life. And it had all started with a stranger who refused to treat his daughter as broken. By the time Edward finally went to bed, the storm still raging outside, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever Nia was doing, it was working, and he wasn't sure if that terrified him or gave him hope. Edward didn't sleep much that night, long after the storm quieted. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Clara's laughter and those 4 miraculous steps replaying in his mind like a film he couldn't pause. By morning, the memory felt both sharp and unreal, as if it had been a dream. But the image of her walking, legs trembling, smile radiant, was burned into him. Over breakfast, Clara chatted about the airplane game with Nia, her voice lighter than he'd heard in years. Dr. Carver, however, sat stiff in her chair, clearly unimpressed. "This kind of progress can be deceptive," she warned, her tone clinical. "We need structured therapy, not play." Nia didn't respond, just offered Clara another slice of toast, her calm presence in sharp contrast to Carver's tight-lipped disapproval. Edward, sipping his coffee, felt the tension in the air but said nothing. He didn't yet understand how Nia had done it, and part of him didn't want to admit that it had happened outside the framework of all the expensive treatments he had endorsed. But another part, deep, stubborn, was curious. Later that morning, while Clara was upstairs coloring, Edward found Nia in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. "How did you get her to do that?" he asked without preamble. Nia dried her hands on a towel, met his gaze, and said, "By not making walking the goal." His brow furrowed. "What does that even mean?" She leaned against the counter, her expression steady. "When you've been through something that breaks you, people often think they can fix you by forcing you toward the finish line. But sometimes, healing starts when you forget there's a finish line at all." Clara wasn't thinking about walking. She was thinking about flying. And in that moment, her body remembered it could move. Her words unsettled him. He wanted to argue, to point out that she had no medical training, no degrees on her wall. But before he could, Marcus Reed, the groundskeeper, stepped in from the garden, shaking off the morning drizzle. "Whatever she's doing," Marcus said, glancing between them. "It's working. That little girl's been smiling more these past 2 weeks than I've seen in the last 2 years. Edward turned to him, a little surprised. Marcus wasn't one to give opinions freely. "And you think that's because of games?" Edward asked. Marcus shrugged. "I think it's because she finally has someone who talks to her, not at her." The words lingered, gnawing at him. That afternoon, Dr. Carver cornered him in his study. "Mr. Hartwell, I must insist we return to a controlled rehabilitation program. This woman's interference could undo years of careful progress." He raised an eyebrow. "Years of progress? Until last night. She hadn't taken a single step." Carver's lips thinned. "Emotional manipulation can create the illusion of progress. It's not sustainable." He bristled at the implication that what he'd seen was an illusion. "So you're saying I imagined it?" She sighed, as though speaking to someone too stubborn to see reason. "I'm saying we need to protect Clara from disappointment." Nia walked in just in time to hear that. "What she needs protection from," she said firmly, "is being treated like a problem that can only be solved in a clinic." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of—" "I'm accusing you of hiding behind experts because it's easier than facing her pain," Nia cut in, her voice calm but unyielding. The accusation landed like a blow. For a moment, he saw the truth in it. How he had filled the space between himself and Clara with appointments and professionals. How he had been afraid to simply be present. The air between them crackled, the argument teetering on the edge of something raw. "You don't know what it's like," he said tightly. "You have no idea what it's cost me, what it's cost her." Nia's expression softened, but her voice held steady. "I know more than you think." She hesitated, then told him about Jonah, the little boy she used to care for, who had been struck with symptoms much like Clara's after an accident. His parents wanted results. They pushed. They ignored what he was feeling inside. And one day, his body just gave up. He was gone before anyone realized the damage wasn't in his legs. It was in his heart. Her voice caught, but she pressed on. "I'm not letting that happen again." The room fell silent. Edward felt something shift in his chest, an unwelcome pang of empathy for this woman he barely knew. Still, his pride bristled. "So what? You're here to save us?" he asked. "No," Nia said quietly. "I'm here to give her a chance to save herself." She left the study without waiting for his reply. That evening, Marcus found Edward standing on the balcony, staring out at the restless sea. "You know," Marcus said, leaning on the railing beside him. "Storms pass whether you're ready or not. But some folks get so used to the dark clouds, they forget what the sun feels like." Edward glanced at him. "Are we still talking about the weather?" Marcus smiled faintly. "You tell me." The next day, Sarah Lynn, Clara's former nanny, stopped by for a visit. She greeted Edward warmly, but her eyes lingered on Nia with subtle suspicion. When she saw Clara in the garden, running her hands along the flowers while Nia crouched nearby telling her a story about dolphins. Sarah pulled Edward aside. "She's pushing her too fast," Sarah warned. "Clara needs stability, not constant stimulation." Edward hesitated. "She's happier than I've seen her in a long time." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "Happiness isn't the same as healing." That night, a storm rolled in again, lightning flashing across the ocean. Clara woke up crying from the thunder, her small body shaking. Edward rushed to her room, but froze at the doorway. Nia was already there, sitting on the edge of the bed, stroking Clara's hair, softly humming a lullaby. The child's breathing slowed, her hands unclenching, her eyes fluttering closed again. Edward stood there, unseen, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and helplessness. He realized that for all his resources, he didn't know how to comfort his own daughter. Not the way Nia did. Back in his room, he poured himself a drink, but it tasted hollow. The truth gnawed at him. Nia was succeeding where he had failed, not because of skill or training, but because she was willing to be present in Clara's world. And if he was honest, he didn't know if he had the courage to do the same. He thought of Lily, how she had once told him, "You can't schedule love, Edward. You have to show up for it." Back then, he had smiled and kissed her forehead, certain he understood. Now, staring into the glass in his hand, he realized he hadn't understood at all. The next morning, the sky was a pale gray, the kind of muted calm that followed a night of storms. But inside the villa, there was a different kind of restlessness. Edward stood at the kitchen counter, watching Nia braid Clara's hair while humming softly. Clara sat perfectly still, her eyes closed, as if the simple rhythm of Nia's hands was its own kind of therapy. Edward cleared his throat, more to break the spell than because he had something to say. "I'm taking the day off," he announced. Both Nia and Clara looked at him, surprised. He rarely stayed home unless absolutely necessary. "We're going to the beach," he added. Clara's face lit up instantly, and she clapped her hands. "With Nia?" she asked. Edward hesitated, then nodded. "With Nia?" The words tasted strange on his tongue, but they felt right. The beach had always been a complicated place for Edward. It was where Lily had taken Clara on the day of the accident. The ocean was beautiful. Yes, but to him it had always held an edge of danger, a reminder of how quickly life could turn. As they walked down the winding path to the sand, Clara clung to Nia's hand, her small legs working harder than usual. The salt air was sharp, the sound of waves both soothing and unsettling. Nia encouraged Clara to stop every few feet, pointing out seashells, drawing shapes in the sand with a stick, telling her a story about a brave little dolphin who learned to swim again after a storm. Edward walked behind them, listening, realizing that Clara wasn't just hearing a story, she was seeing herself in it. Halfway down the beach, they stopped near a cluster of smooth rocks. Clara sat on one while Nia told her to close her eyes and listen to the ocean's heartbeat. Edward almost laughed at the phrase, but then Clara said quietly, "It's not scary anymore." The words caught him off guard. She had been terrified of the ocean since the accident. He glanced at Nia, who simply smiled as if she had been expecting this. On the walk back, Sarah Lynn was waiting near the villa's garden gate. She had called earlier, saying she wanted to check in on Clara, but Edward could see the way her gaze went first to Nia and then to Clara's legs. "I hope you're not overdoing it," Sarah said, crouching down to Clara's level. "Walking too much can make you tired." "Sweetheart." Nia's jaw tightened. "She's fine," she replied, her voice measured. Sarah stood, crossing her arms. "Fine for now. But what about later?" Edward sensed the tension brewing and stepped between them. "We'll be careful," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, Sarah or himself. That evening, Clara wanted to play her airplane game again. They cleared a space in the living room, and Nia guided her through the motions. Edward watched from the couch, hands clasped, noting how Clara's balance was improving. It wasn't just her legs. Her whole demeanor had shifted. She laughed more, asked more questions, looked less like the withdrawn child she had been for so long. But the more progress he saw, the more conflicted he felt. Every step forward was proof that Nia was right. and that he had been wrong for so long. A few days later, another storm rolled in. The wind rattled the glass, and thunder cracked across the horizon. Clara's eyes widened in fear, her small body tensing. Edward moved toward her, intending to comfort her, but before he could reach her, Nia knelt beside her, wrapping her in a soft blanket. She began to sing a lullaby, not in English, but in a gentle, lilting language Edward didn't recognize. Slowly, Clara's breathing calmed. She leaned against Nia, listening to the melody until the storm outside seemed far away. Edward stood a few feet away, feeling strangely useless. He had never been able to reach Clara like that. Later, when Clara was asleep, he found Nia in the kitchen making tea. "What language was that?" he asked. She glanced up. "Swahili. My grandmother used to sing it to me when I was scared." He nodded slowly. "It worked." Nia gave a small smile. "It always did." For a moment, they stood in silence. The only sound, the rain tapping against the window. Edward wanted to ask more about her life, about the things that had shaped her into the person who could walk into a stranger's home and change everything. But before he could, his phone buzzed with an email notification. Another meeting, another demand on his time. He silenced it without looking. The next morning, Marcus stopped Edward on the front lawn. "You ever notice how that little girl's eyes follow Nia everywhere?" Marcus asked. Edward frowned. "She's just comfortable with her." Marcus shook his head. "It's more than that. She trusts her. And trust like that, well, it doesn't come easy after what she's been through." Edward didn't respond, but the words stayed with him all day. That afternoon, Sarah returned with a small gift for Clara, a stuffed rabbit she had loved as a toddler. Clara accepted it politely but set it aside almost immediately, choosing instead to play a seashell game with Nia. Edward caught the flicker of hurt in Sarah's eyes. "She's changed," Sarah said quietly when Nia stepped out of the room. "I'm not sure if it's good or bad." Edward felt a twinge of defensiveness. "It's good," he said firmly. But later, alone in his study, he wondered, was it possible for something to be both? That night, as he passed Clara's room, he overheard her talking to Nia. "Do you think I can run someday?" Clara asked. Nia's voice was warm. "I don't just think it. I know it. And when you do, I'll be right there beside you." Edward paused, his throat tightening. He realized he wanted to be there too, not just physically, but truly present. The question was whether he was ready to step into that role. The days that followed were a mix of progress and pushback. Clara's steps grew steadier, her laughter more frequent, but Dr. Carver continued to voice her disapproval during weekly check-ins, warning Edward about unstructured intervention and emotional dependency. Sarah remained wary, offering subtle reminders of the old ways of caring for Clara. Yet each time Edward saw his daughter's face light up in Nia's presence, those warnings seemed to fade into the background. One evening, as another light rain began to fall, Edward stood at the window watching the waves crash against the rocks. He thought about Lily, how she had always believed in following the heart over the handbook, how she had once said, "Love doesn't heal you because it's perfect. It heals you because it shows up, even when it's messy." He wondered what she would think of Nia, of the changes unfolding in their home. And for the first time in a long while, he hoped, really hoped, that maybe they were on the right path. The tension in the Hartwell villa reached its breaking point one Friday evening when an unexpected knock echoed through the great room. Edward opened the door to find his older brother, James, standing there, rain dripping from his coat collar, his eyes sharp with the kind of mischief that always preceded trouble. They hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years, not since James's drinking had cost him both his marriage and Edward's trust. "Heard you've got a miracle worker living here," James said with a crooked grin, stepping inside without being invited. Edward stiffened. "It's not like that," he replied, but James was already glancing around, taking in the warmth that had begun to seep back into the home. Dinner was awkward from the start. Clara sat between Edward and Nia, picking at her food, while James filled the silence with half-joking jabs about Edward's parenting. "Never thought I'd see you with your sleeves rolled up, little brother. Guess miracles do happen," he said, his tone teasing but edged with something sharper. Edward clenched his jaw, ignoring the bait, but when James leaned back and muttered, "Maybe if you'd been around more, she wouldn't have ended up in that chair," the words landed like a punch. The air went still. Clara's fork froze midway to her mouth. "Stop," Edward said, his voice low, but James pressed on, his voice rising. "No, someone needs to say it. You were too busy building your empire to notice your family falling apart. Lily deserved better. Clara deserved better." Edward's chair scraped back hard against the floor as he stood. "You don't get to talk about Lily," he snapped, his voice shaking. Nia rose quickly, putting a protective hand on Clara's shoulder, but Clara's eyes were locked on her father, wide and fearful. James smirked, as if enjoying the reaction. But then something unexpected happened. Clara pushed back her chair, gripped the edge of the table, and slowly stood. Her legs trembled, but she took one step, then another, crossing the space between them. "Daddy," she said softly, tugging on his sleeve, "don't fight." The room went silent. Edward's anger melted into something raw and fragile as he looked down at her. "You're standing," he whispered, as though saying it aloud might break the spell. Clara nodded, taking another small step toward him, then another, until she was wrapped in his arms. James stared, stunned, his mouth half open. Edward held her close, feeling the delicate strength in her legs, the way her heart beat against his chest. He looked over her head at Nia, whose eyes were bright but calm, as if she had known Clara could do this all along. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Edward's voice cracked as he said, "I'm sorry. Clara, I've been here, but I haven't been here. I should have been the one helping you take these steps, not hiding behind meetings and doctors." Clara pressed her face into his shirt. James shifted uncomfortably, his bravado slipping. "Guess I'm not the only one who's screwed things up," he admitted, his voice quieter now. Edward glanced at him, the years of resentment between them still there but softened by the moment. "We've both got things to fix," Edward said. They moved to the living room, where Clara sat curled up between Edward and Nia, her head resting on Nia's arm. James stood by the fireplace, looking unusually unsure of himself. "You know," he said, "when I hit rock bottom, I kept telling myself I'd make things right with the people I hurt. I just never thought you'd let me." Edward looked at his brother for a long moment before replying, "I don't know if I can yet, but maybe we can start." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door left open. Later that night, after James had been shown to the guest room, Edward found Nia in the kitchen making tea. "Thank you," he said quietly. She looked up. "For what?" He gestured toward the living room. "For giving her the courage to stand tonight, for giving me the courage to see her." Nia smiled faintly. "She's had that courage all along. She just needed a reason to use it." He studied her for a moment, realizing how much she had shifted the center of his world in such a short time. As he turned to leave, she said softly, "You don't have to be perfect, Edward. You just have to be present." The words followed him down the hallway. echoing in his mind until he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought of Lily again. How she'd always said love was about showing up even when it was hard. Maybe, he realized, this was what she'd meant all along, upstairs. James lay awake too, listening to the faint sound of the ocean. He wasn't sure what had moved him more, seeing Clara walk or seeing his brother cry. Either way, something in him shifted. The Hartwell home, for the first time in years, had seen not just conflict, but connection. And while the storms outside had passed, Edward knew the real work was just beginning. The days after James's visit felt different inside the Hartwell villa. Warmer, more alive. But with that warmth came a new kind of fear for Edward. He had seen Clara take steps twice now, once in the living room and once at that fraught dinner, and each time it had been like watching a miracle bloom in front of him. Yet miracles, in his experience, were fragile things, easily broken if handled the wrong way. So he made a decision. He would be home more, no more leaving before breakfast or returning after she was asleep. He began joining Clara and Nia for their morning walks in the garden, reading aloud from the old storybooks Lily used to love, even kneeling in the sand to help build lopsided castles on the beach. At first, it felt awkward, almost like intruding into a rhythm Nia and Clara had already built without him. But slowly, Clara began to look for him during games, tugging at his sleeve, calling him to join. Each time she did. A piece of the wall he had carried inside himself since Lily's death cracked a little more. One breezy afternoon, Marcus sat with Edward on the back steps, sipping coffee while Clara and Nia planted flowers nearby. "You're getting the hang of it," Marcus said, his tone casual but his eyes knowing. "What?" Edward asked. Marcus gestured toward Clara. Being her dad, not just in name, but in the ways that matter. Edward let the words settle. It wasn't praise he was used to hearing, but it meant more than he expected. Sarah stopped by that evening, holding a batch of cookies she had baked. She watched Clara walk across the kitchen to grab a glass of milk, her steps more confident than before. "She's improving," Sarah admitted, her voice softer than it had been in weeks. "I was wrong about rushing things." Then her gaze moved to Nia. "But be careful," she added gently. "When you get too close. It hurts more if you have to say goodbye." Nia didn't flinch, but later, as she and Edward cleaned up, she spoke quietly. "Sarah's right about one thing. I've been scared too. Scared of losing her the way I lost Jonah." Edward paused mid-rinse, looking at her. "You're not going to lose her," he said firmly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." That promise was tested sooner than he expected. A few days later, Clara was running her fingers along the wildflowers at the cliff's edge, while Edward and Nia sat nearby talking. In a blink, her foot slipped on the damp grass, and she pitched forward toward the drop. Edward's heart stopped. He was on his feet in an instant, sprinting across the lawn, grabbing her arm just before her weight could pull her over. She let out a startled cry, clinging to him as he pulled her back to safety. His knees hit the ground hard, but he barely felt it. His arms were wrapped around Clara so tightly, it was as if he could shield her from the whole world. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm never letting go." Nia knelt beside them, her own face pale. "She's okay," she said, brushing a strand of hair from Clara's forehead. But Edward could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. It matched his own, when they finally stood. He kept an arm around Clara all the way back to the villa, as if the space between them might invite disaster. That night, after Clara was asleep, Edward found himself standing in the darkened living room, staring out at the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks, relentless and unyielding. But there was something cleansing about their rhythm. He thought of all the nights he had stood here before, feeling only emptiness. Tonight was different. Tonight. He understood what it meant to be fully present, not just as a protector, but as a father who was willing to take the falls, the fears, and the risks that came with loving someone completely. The next morning, Clara walked into the kitchen without holding on to anything. "I want pancakes," she announced, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Edward grinned, lifting her onto a stool. "Pancakes it is." Nia moved around the kitchen, flipping batter on the griddle, and Edward noticed something in her expression. Pride. Yes, but also relief. They were becoming a team, unspoken but understood. By the weekend, the change in the house was impossible to ignore. James had decided to stay in Monterey for a while, checking himself into a local therapy program. Marcus spent more time inside, telling Clara stories about his late wife and teaching her how to whistle. Even Sarah began stopping by, not with warnings, but with small gifts and encouragement. And through it all, Edward remained present. He still took the occasional call for work, but never at the expense of time with Clara. He read to her on rainy afternoons, chased her through the garden on sunny mornings, and when she stumbled, he was the first to reach out his hand. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the water, Edward sat on the porch with Nia while Clara chased Marcus's old border collie across the yard. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. Nia shook her head. "Clara changed herself. I just gave her the space to try." He studied her for a long moment, wanting to say more, but letting the silence between them hold what words couldn't. When Clara came running up, cheeks flushed and eyes bright, she looked between them and grinned. "We're a family now," she said, matter of fact. Before dashing back toward the dog, Edward and Nia exchanged a glance, both smiling, because for the first time in years, the word didn't feel like a memory. It felt real. It felt possible. And it felt like it was here to stay. The summer light spilled through the wide glass windows of the Hartwell villa as if the house itself had finally decided to breathe again. Clara was walking with ease now, still careful, still deliberate, but without the hesitation that had once clung to every movement. She crossed the living room barefoot, holding up a crayon drawing and announcing proudly, "It's us, my family." Edward took the paper from her, studying the uneven figures, himself, Clara, Nia, Marcus, and even James, all drawn beneath a bright yellow sun with the word family scrawled in rainbow letters across the top. Something caught in his throat. "It's perfect," he said, kissing the top of her head. Clara beamed and ran to show Nia, who had just stepped in from the garden carrying a basket of fresh flowers. Nia crouched down to examine the drawing, her face softening into a smile. "Is that me?" she asked, pointing to the tall figure with curly hair. "You're Auntie Nia," Clara said simply, as if it had always been so. Later that afternoon, Edward found Nia arranging the flowers in a vase. "She called you Auntie," he said, leaning against the counter. Nia gave a small, almost shy smile. "Kids make up their own titles when something matters to them." He hesitated, then took a breath. "I'd like you to stay, not just as a housekeeper, but as her caregiver, permanently. I know it's not what you planned when you came here, but—" She cut him off gently. "I'll stay." He blinked, a little surprised at how quickly she answered. "Just like that?" She nodded. "Just like that. I don't walk away from family." Word of Clara's progress began to ripple through their small circle. James, who had been sober for 2 months now, made a habit of stopping by the villa daily. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes just a deck of cards to play with Clara. He had also started seeing a therapist in town, a fact he shared with Edward one evening over coffee. "It's hard work," James admitted. But I'm starting to understand why I ran from everything that mattered. I don't want to do that anymore. Edward studied his brother's face, seeing sincerity where once there had been only bluster. Then don't, he said simply. Even Sarah, once so skeptical of Nia, seemed to soften. She visited with a picnic basket one afternoon, setting it down on the beach where they had gathered to celebrate Clara's latest milestone, walking the entire stretch of sand without stopping. Marcus grilled fish over an open flame, and Dr. Helen Carver, of all people, showed up in a simple blue sundress, her usual stiffness replaced by something more relaxed. She pulled Edward aside quietly. "I was wrong about Nia," she said. "I thought what she was doing would undermine the work we'd been trying to do. But maybe I was so focused on the clinical side. I forgot about the human one. She gave Clara something I couldn't." Edward nodded. She gave her hope. When the food was ready, they all sat on blankets spread across the sand. The ocean stretched out endlessly in front of them, waves lapping gently at the shore. Clara ran back and forth between the group and the water, holding up seashells for inspection, her laughter bright against the sound of the tide. At one point, she brought Nia a small piece of sea glass. "It's like us," Clara said. "It used to be sharp, but now it's smooth and pretty." Nia held the glass between her fingers, her eyes glistening. "That's a good way to put it." After dinner, as the sun began to sink into the horizon, Edward stood and cleared his throat. "I just want to say something," he began, his voice carrying over the soft crash of the waves. 2 months ago, I didn't think this day would come. I didn't think I'd see my daughter walk on this beach again, let alone run. But here we are. And it's because of all of you, because of the patience, the love, and the belief you've shown her when I didn't even know how to believe myself. Nia." He turned to her, his voice tightening. "I'll never be able to repay what you've given us. But I promise you this. You'll always have a place here." The group clapped softly, and Nia, unaccustomed to being the center of attention, simply inclined her head in thanks. Clara ran into Edward's arms, then into Nia's, wrapping her small arms around both of them at once. "We're staying like this forever," she declared, and no one had the heart to disagree. As twilight settled, the beach became a patchwork of shadows and golden light. Marcus told a story about his late wife's first attempt at fishing, how she'd caught a boot instead of a fish, and had everyone laughing. James pulled out his guitar and began strumming a simple tune, one Lily had loved. Edward felt the familiar ache of missing her. But this time, it didn't come with the crushing weight it used to. Instead, it felt like she was there, woven into the fabric of this moment, proud of the family they were building. When it grew dark, they walked back to the villa together, the path lit by lanterns Marcus had hung along the way. Inside, Clara fell asleep almost immediately, curled up on the couch with the stuffed rabbit Sarah had given her. Edward lingered in the doorway of the living room, watching her chest rise and fall, the faintest smile still on her lips. He glanced at Nia, who stood beside him. "She's happy," he said softly. Nia nodded. "So are you." And he was. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a monument to loss. It felt alive. It felt like a place where love could grow, messy and imperfect, but strong enough to weather any storm. As Edward switched off the lights and headed upstairs, he realized something. This wasn't just a turning point for Clara. It was a turning point for all of them. The storms would come again, as they always did. But now, they wouldn't be facing them alone. Months later. The Hartwell villa no longer felt like the cavernous monument to grief it once was. It pulsed with warmth, movement, and laughter. Mornings began with the sound of Clara's feet pattering down the hallway, her voice calling for Auntie Nia before she even looked for her father. Edward no longer minded. In fact, he loved it. He had learned to join their world instead of trying to control it. This particular Saturday, sunlight poured through the windows, glinting off the ocean beyond the cliffs. Clara stood at the edge of the living room rug, one hand on her hip, the other holding a seashell. "Come on, Daddy," she said with mock impatience. "We're going to dance." Edward chuckled, setting down his coffee. "Dance? You mean on the beach?" Clara nodded and looked at Nia. "Auntie Nia says the ocean likes it when we dance with it." Nia smiled at Edward, and something unspoken passed between them. An invitation, not just to the beach, but into a moment that mattered. They walked down together, Marcus and James trailing behind with a blanket and a thermos of tea. The sand was cool beneath their feet, the air tinged with salt and the faint sweetness of blooming coastal flowers. Clara took Nia's hands first, twirling clumsily, her small feet kicking up little sprays of sand. Edward watched, smiling, until Clara suddenly darted to him and grabbed his hands instead. "You too," she insisted. He laughed, remembering how long it had been since he'd danced at all. In a rush of memory, he saw Lily in their old kitchen, barefoot, spinning to some song on the radio, calling him to join her. Back then, he had always found a reason to say no. This time, he stepped forward without hesitation. They moved in a loose circle, Edward, Clara, and Nia, turning slowly, the waves swelling and breaking beside them like a rhythm they could follow. James sat on the blanket, strumming his guitar softly, the same tune from that beach gathering weeks ago. Marcus leaned back on his elbows, his eyes crinkling at the sight of the little girl who had once been too afraid to take a single step. Now, spinning in the sunlight, Clara's laughter rose above the music, bright and untamed. At one point, Clara let go of their hands entirely and began running toward the edge of the waves. Edward's chest tightened, but this time, it wasn't fear, it was awe. Her legs moved freely, her arms spread wide as if she were trying to embrace the horizon. When she reached the foamy edge, she stopped and let the water rush over her feet, turning back to them with a grin that was pure triumph. "I did it!" she called, as if they could have missed it. Nia clapped, and Edward felt his throat constrict with the kind of gratitude words could never capture. They stayed on the beach for hours. James played until his fingers were sore. Marcus told another story about his wife, this one about how she used to swear the ocean had moods. Nia lay back on the blanket beside Clara, helping her find shapes in the clouds. Edward sat with them, not on the edge but right in the middle of the moment, as much a part of it as anyone else. There was no nagging thought about work, no restless pull toward his phone, just the sound of the waves, the laughter of people he cared about, and the realization that this right here, was the life he hadn't known he needed. When they finally climbed back up to the villa, the sky was streaked with the soft pinks and golds of early evening. Clara raced ahead with Marcus, determined to show him the seashell she had picked as the most special one. Edward and Nia walked behind them, their shoulders almost touching. For a while, they said nothing, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath their steps. Then Edward spoke. "You know, Lily used to tell me the ocean could heal anything if you let it." Nia glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "Do you believe that now?" He smiled faintly. "I think I do." Inside, the house smelled faintly of the tea James had brewed. Clara was already curled up on the couch, Marcus beside her, while James tuned his guitar again. Edward stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in, the easy way everyone fit together, the absence of the brittle tension that had once filled these walls. It wasn't just that Clara had learned to walk again. It was that they had all learned to live again. Later, after Clara had gone to bed and the others had settled in for the night, Edward stepped out onto the balcony. The moon hung low over the water, its reflection broken into shimmering fragments on the waves. He thought about the path that had brought them here, how close he had come to losing more than just Lily, how much he had needed someone like Nia to remind him that showing up was the only thing that really mattered. She joined him a moment later, leaning on the railing beside him. Neither of them spoke right away. The sound of the ocean filled the quiet between them, steady and eternal. Finally, Edward turned to her. "You've changed this house," he said. "You've changed me." Nia shook her head slightly. "I didn't change you. You just decided to stop hiding." He let out a small laugh. "Either way, I'm glad you're here." They stood together for a while longer, the cool breeze off the water brushing past them, before heading back inside. In the morning, Clara would wake up ready for another day of adventures. Marcus would be in the garden, James would have the coffee brewing, and Nia would be in the kitchen humming as she made breakfast. And Edward would be there, truly there, to see it all. The storms in their lives hadn't vanished, but they no longer defined them. The ocean still roared, the waves still broke, but now its rhythm matched the one they had found together. And as Clara ran toward those waves again and again, fearless now, Edward knew one thing for certain: they had all come home. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Your support helps us share more meaningful stories. See you in the next one.